and welcome. Good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Brown, and I am your Professional Development and Legislative Affairs Program Manager here at NISAW. Welcome to National Invasive Species Awareness Week, Day 2. So glad that you're able to be here with us. I am absolutely thrilled to have today's presenter, Stephanie Showalter Otts, with us from the National Sea Grant Law Center. I have had the pleasure of working with Stephanie for more than a decade, and she is just a wealth of energy and knowledge and information, and I'm so excited that she has taken the time out to be with us today. So the title of today's webinar is the Model Legal Framework for State Aquatic Invasive Species Program and Resource Toolkit for Local Governments. Before I introduce Stephanie, I want to share just a little bit with all of you about NISAW for those of you that don't know us well. Our mission here at the North American Invasive Species Management Association is to support, promote, and empower invasive species prevention and management in North America. A little bit about what we do here at NISAW. We are the stewards of international standards. We have our mapping standard and our certified weed-free products program standards that include forage, gravel, and new this year is mulch. Obviously, NISAW, National Invasive Species Awareness Week, is a cornerstone here. Advocacy and education is one of the main things that we do at NISAW, as well as public outreach and awareness. And so Play Clean Go is our program focused on educating recreationists, and Play Clean Go Awareness Week is June 6th through 12th. So please, as soon as we're done with NISAW, we're going to switch over and get into that. There's already a lot of good stuff going on. Check it out at playcleango.org and get involved. And then professional development, we have the Invasive Species Manager Certification Program. Spring semester is wrapping up. Summer is right around the corner. Webinars and trainings such as this one, and of course our annual conference. So save the date, September 27th through 30th in Missoula, Montana. This will be a hybrid event, so if you're not able to join us in person in Montana, we will have a virtual offering for you. So just keep a lookout on our website for more information about that. If you're not already a member of NISAW, please take a look at NISAW.org. We have 3 individual memberships and 4 partnership opportunities for you to take a look at with oodles of benefits, and we can customize partnerships if you're interested in a custom partnership. One of my favorite member benefits is our first Friday event. The next one is happening June 4th. This is a members only networking event. It's a lot of fun. And next month in June, we'll be talking about public education and outreach in advance of Play Clean Go. Okay, so again, our mission is to support, promote, and empower invasive species prevention and management across North America. Let's get on with the show for today's webinar. Again, it's my pleasure to introduce Stephanie to you. Stephanie Otts is the director of the National Sea Grant Law Center at the University of Mississippi School of Law. Stephanie received a BA in history from Penn State University and a joint JD Master's of Studies in Environmental Law from Vermont Law School. She is licensed to practice law in Pennsylvania and Mississippi. As director, Stephanie oversees a variety of legal education, research, and outreach activities, including providing legal research services to Sea Grant constituents on ocean and coastal law issues. Her research on natural resources, marine, and environmental law issues have been published in a variety of publications. She's conducted extensive research on legal issues related to invasive species management and is currently serving as the lead on 2 federally funded legal research projects related to aquaculture. One exploring the issues of property rights for offshore aquaculture, and one examining food safety regimes governing seaweed aquaculture. So with that, I want to introduce Stephanie. I'm really excited about what she has to present today. Please, if you have questions, at the bottom of the Zoom screen, you have a Q&A bar. Put your questions in the Q&A for us. We will answer questions after the presentation. And you can go ahead and look and see if the question has already been asked and click the little like button. That'll promote it to the top of the queue. All right, so with that, I am going to invite Stephanie to go ahead and share your screen, and I will mute out.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm honored to give a presentation of kind of our work on invasive species programs. So I'm presenting today on behalf of Lisa DeBruyckere with Creative Resource Strategy, who's been a partner on these projects throughout. So just a starting point from kind of the legal perspective, as Elizabeth mentioned, so I'm an environmental attorney by training, and the National Sea Grant Law Center provides legal research and services. And so we've been involved in aquatic invasive species from that law and policy perspective. And when we became involved in these projects related to recreational watercraft out west, one thing that we learned really quickly is that there were a lot of state laws on the books related to aquatic invasive species. You know, almost every state says you can't sell, transport, bring in, import invasive species into your state. And then there were a lot of states that had enacted laws related to the recreational watercraft vector. So we weren't working with a clean slate when we were coming in, but the challenge was all of these laws were different, right? Every state kind of takes their own approach, has their own culture with respect to law and policy. So how do you get everyone on the same page? And that was really the struggle in the Western United States. You had all of the states were developing watercraft inspection and decontamination programs. They were trying to get to the same place, reducing the risk of spread of mussels from watercraft, but their standards were all a little bit different. Some prohibited different things. There was a lot of tension among, states that some felt some states were doing more than others, and everybody was butting heads. And so at the time, the National Sea Grant Law Center was doing continuing legal education workshops for attorneys generals. And we started with just a pilot in the Chesapeake Bay to bring people together to learn more about aquatic invasive species laws and the enforcement challenges. And we were encouraged by the Fish and Wildlife Service to reach out to other regions to see if they might be interested. And the Western Regional Panel said, yeah, we'd actually like you to come out here and help us think about and learn more about our state laws with respect to invasive species. Out of those kind of conversations emerged this idea that the team collectively referred to as building consensus, where we really wanted to bring together the key players on law and policy decision-making into the same room. And so we viewed those as the AIS coordinators in the states, so the individuals that were really implementing these AIS programs, law enforcement officers that worked with them to enforce those programs, and then assistant attorney generals who are most likely involved either during the legislative or regulatory process. So maybe they are the ones that are writing the regulations or working with legislative committees to address questions about legislation, or also providing interpretations with respect to the law or prosecuting violations. And so we really wanted to get these individuals from across the West into the same room to really share what was going on. Like, what are their concerns? How do they think the law are being interpreted? What are their questions? And so we started that. Our first meeting was in Phoenix, Arizona, way back in 2012. I can't believe it's almost been 10 years since the group first got together. And out of that Phoenix meeting emerged a work plan that had a long list of actions that the participants really thought needed to be worked on in order to move the conversation forward. And one of those action plans involved looking at developing model legislation or model language for these watercraft inspection programs. And so it involved, following that Phoenix meeting, we started to get together. We tried to get together once a year. In some years, we had a little bigger space than others. And so you'll see here, we met 3 times in Denver, and then we had a meeting in Albuquerque. There were dozens of calls between meetings. All of these were really essential for helping to network the participants together so that they could get to know their colleagues in other states. Some also didn't know their attorney generals in their own states. And so it was an opportunity to network, to build trust, to learn more about where everybody was coming from. And then the National Sea Grant Law Center provided legal research support during and throughout this process. So when questions came up about, well, what is the law in a certain state, we helped to find that out, or we looked into what legal barriers might exist to moving programs forward. Sometimes they were real and that a law would need to be changed to allow something to happen, but sometimes it was just a perception. And once you did the research and kind of shared that information, it reduced the barrier. And then we developed and maintained a compilation of state laws that are relevant to these programs that was a resource for the participants throughout the process. And ultimately, this became our image of kind of where we were going, where collectively the Western states were trying to go. So we were trying to get to the top of this very large mountain, which is idealized, right? We kind of recognize that we may never get to the top of that mountain. There are limited resources, there's limited capacity, there's staff turnover. It's a huge challenge. But if you're going to be able to have effective interstate programs and communication and enforcement, you really need the solid foundation of a common language and kind of common standards for what you're working towards. And so collectively, the group set forth to develop this model legal framework that consisted of 3 components: a model law, looking at authorizing legislation. What would a state agency need in their legislation to effectively run a program? Then a model regulation, kind of stepping it down a little bit to say, okay, now we have the authority. What is some more details that we would need to put in a regulation? And then a model memorandum of understanding that could help promote interstate cooperation. But essential to all of this were protocols and standards. And so that's where kind of the collective work of the Western states has been really important. They had, the manual for watercraft decontamination and inspection, and they have training programs and developed a lot of other protocols and standards that were informing how the regulatory programs were moving forward. And so throughout this, 5-6 year process, we really continually tried to work towards consensus. And so, how do we get people kind of moving together in the same direction? There was a lot of tension at times, and we had to do conflict resolution. It's hard to kind of take off your state hat and try to think in a hypothetical situation about, well, what would I want the legal framework to look like, even if I know that would never work in my state because my state legislature wouldn't approve a fee, for instance, for aquatic invasive species. But if I had that, that would be great, right? So a lot of just conversations, again, trying to help people get to know each other so that they could trust and share and be honest about where they were with their programs and management, funding, and capacity. So ultimately, this resulted in the model legal framework. And so the work specifically for these documents was funded by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to help support the work of the National Sea Grant Law Center, to conduct the research, and to facilitate the kind of conversations among the attorneys generals that really helped to inform the process. And we had many other kind of facilitators, Lisa DeBruyckere, Leah Elwell, that you probably all know, that facilitated the bigger process. But so these documents are available on the National Sea Grant Law Center's website. It is a full model law model regulation and model MOU. They all have example language to authorize key portions of watercraft inspection and decontamination programs. And then there are also explanatory notes that I think are really useful and important to providing a background for why a particular provision was included, and also considerations that states may want to take into account when they're moving forward with the programs. These documents are not meant to be adopted verbatim. As I mentioned at the beginning, states had a lot of laws on the books already, and so we didn't want anyone to start from scratch. What they were a resource to help move discussions forward and identify areas where there really should be some consistency or kind of improvements as well. And so that's kind of how the approach was taken. I have been amazed. It was wonderful to be part of this process and to really see how the model legal framework was embraced by the participants and the states. So more than a dozen Western states have amended laws and regulations to incorporate the consensus policies and model authorities that were adopted through this process. And it continues today. There are still states kind of tweaking their laws with respect to drain plugs and definitions. We were also, the timing was nice that it could also inform the development of the programs in several of the Western Canadian provinces who joined some of the workshops and learned from the Western states as they were developing their programs. It was also embraced by the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies that encouraged states to really look at standardized regulations, specifically with drain plugs and plant material. And so legislative activity, continues every year. There are kind of new changes to regulations and laws that are helpful. So when we kind of wrapped up the model MOU, Lisa DeBruyckere and I were thinking about, felt like there was a missing piece of this. So the model legal framework focuses on state and state agencies and what state agencies need, but state agencies are not the only player when it comes to ANS management. Obviously, we have the federal government, we also have tribal governments, but there are also active local governments. And many local governments, especially in California, because of the way the California law is written, are the ones managing the program. And so Lisa received funding to look into a model kind of reciprocal certification program for Clear Lake and 3 other lakes in Northern California. And it was a very complicated jurisdictional mix because you had the Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation with some jurisdiction. You also had like 3 different county governments. And so it was a really interesting project that involved interviews with all of the managers of these lakes to think about how you might build a reciprocal program to prevent the spread of mussels in this area. One of the county governments already had a local ordinance dealing with watercraft inspection and decontamination. And so the National Sea Grant Law Center's role on this project was to look at, well, could we do the same thing that we did with the model legal framework for the states and do that on a local level? And so we did research on local ordinances and local authorities and developed a model local watercraft inspection and decontamination ordinance that is based off of the model legal framework and is meant to enhance it. So if you have a state that is following or attempting to incorporate the consensus policies of the model law and model legal framework on the state level, the local ordinance is an option for local governments in that state to also help promote and be consistent with that model framework. And, as I mentioned, you really can't kind of address this challenge on any invasive species pathway without a networked effort, right? So as I mentioned, there are multiple jurisdictions and players in this area, and they all have different roles. And so from my perspective, from the law and policy, you really need these groups kind of working together and being on the same page if you're going to move things forward. But everybody has a different role, right? And there's some overlap, but some is very specific to whatever level of government you're looking at. So, you know, the federal government is really focused on, and where their legal authority lies is preventing species from entering the country. Tribal governments and state governments, they're tied into preventing the spread of invasive species within their territories and their jurisdictions. And so it's prevention and regulatory efforts. And then the municipalities have a pretty large role to play, although it's often been overlooked. And which seems a bit surprising to me when I started this project, because the impacts and effects of AIS are felt locally, right? It's the local communities' water bodies that are being affected, or drinking water or recreational and fishing uses of those waterways. But local governments are also the ones often doing control efforts on city and county properties and right-of-ways. And so a lot of local resources and money is spent on addressing invasive species. And so this led Lisa and I to start thinking more about municipal authority. And so cities and counties can enact, you know, local laws to protect the welfare and safety of their residents, generally speaking, as long as those laws don't conflict with state or federal law. But what you need is these different levels of government to work together to collaboratively address invasive species so that you can more effectively prevent and control risks. And it's an identified gap, and it needs to be filled, in our opinion. If you look at federal and state management plans, the role of local governments is rarely mentioned, if at all. So even though the National Invasive Species Management Plan emphasizes coordination and innovation through partnerships, local governments aren't mentioned. Action plans usually focus on state and federal agencies, or they may only mention local governments in passing without really articulating what the role, as they see it, that the local government can play in whatever management effort they are writing their plan about or seeking to address. And so that's where the second project came in that was going to talk to you about today, which is the local toolkit, or toolkit for local governments. So there were two parts to this project. One, we set out to develop a series of case studies to kind of document a planning framework that could be used to identify priority pathways, and then what existing laws are out there, local laws that can address that, and what are maybe some opportunities. And then we wanted to bring these case studies together with other resources to produce an online handbook. So the process was really, we did research. I handled the research, the law and policy research. Lisa did interviews with our 4 jurisdictions that we produced case studies with, and we sought to identify the high priority AIS for those communities, the pathways that were really a priority, and then to look at, okay, if we've identified a priority pathway, what is the responsible city or county government? Is there a state law or regulation about that discusses the jurisdiction of local governments? Are there any local ordinances or other authorities that address that pathway? And then, you know, what might be some recommendations to move forward? And so that resulted in this local government aquatic invasive species toolkit. And so if technology works with me, I want to stop the screen, and it will just be easier to kind of walk through the website. So the website is live. It's out there. It's a bit of a living document. We continually update some of the information on the case studies as we learn about them. So if this is your first time seeing this website and you dig into it and you have suggestions or thoughts, please let me know, because we can make adjustments and tweaks, and we really do want to add things as we learn about them. But the kind of meat of the website can be found under the regulatory framework tab and then the case study tab. And so there are several. The regulatory framework tab is the toolkit, right? This is where we had the kind of resources that we pulled together or created that were intended to help local governments become a more active player in this area if they want to. So the first thing we thought about is, a question you also get is like, well, do we need a local regulation? The state's doing all kinds of, they have lots of laws. The Fish and Wildlife Service is out here doing things like, why should the local government have a regulation? And that's a really important question, because there may be times that a local ordinance or a local law doesn't really enhance anything. It doesn't strengthen anything. And so we made this really quick kind of decision tree to help a local government kind of think through whether or not a regulation might be helpful. So can the pathway be addressed without regulation? Well, if yes, then you don't need a local ordinance, right? Because you can do it without it. But then it kind of works through situations where there are federal and state laws or there aren't federal and state laws. And so it's just a quick tool to help with that. One of the pieces of the website that we've got the most positive feedback on and has seemed to be very useful is we put together a library of existing examples of local AIS regulation. We know that it is easier for any government, whether it's a state agency for their regulation or a local government, to adopt something if they know someone else has done that or they have a model to follow. So we have collected what we have found by pathway, right? So if your local government is interested in, adopting a general and aquatic invasive species ordinance, there are examples here for that, but there are also examples about anglers, for fishing rules, or for fish escapes and releases, all on the local level. And so we encourage you to browse this. And also, if you know of one that we don't have included, please let us know and we will add it. We have some frequently asked questions, again, just to help local governments think through what we're covering in the toolkit. We also have a section that just talks about this networked approach that I mentioned, where we really try to highlight the different roles of the federal, state, and local governments. And you can see here where there's some overlap, but where the different jurisdictions really kind of take things on their own as well. And so we thought that this was a helpful infographic to just highlight the intersections with the different levels of government. And then just briefly, there's also a section where we have sought to create a library of AIS plans. We started with just local government AIS plans, but then we got some feedback that it would be useful to have more of all the government levels. And so we've tried to be comprehensive. I'm sure we're missing some, but we think it's a great kind of clearinghouse for that information. And then the other piece of it is our case studies. And so we currently have 6 case studies. One we had already done before the toolkit with the city of Portland. Lisa had a separate project with them that was pathway analysis. And then we prepared 5 case studies as part of this project. And the case studies were selected to be geographically diverse. So we wanted to cover the entire country, but we also wanted diversity in type of water body. So some are surrounded by multiple local jurisdictions, some have federal partner, like Corps of Engineers has management control, or different elements of jurisdiction. So all of these case studies are very different. But for each case study, there's a little bit of background about the water body that we were looking at. And then what we did was we did a pathway analysis. And so for Each priority pathway, as I had mentioned before, we went and identified what would be the responsible city county department. Was there a state law or regulation? Was there a local authority? And, you know, what might some recommendations be? So it wasn't always clear who the responsible county would be if there wasn't any law on the books. So you'll see here for seaplanes, you know, municipalities, you know, have the authority in Lake Fremont or in Minnesota to operate and regulate airports, but there wasn't much on the books about seaplanes, so it wasn't quite sure which county or city government would have that. But you can see it goes through, you know, general AIS prevention, stowaways, which are, you know, just related to kind of watercraft primarily. But you can see here, you know, City of Zimmerman, but the Sherburne County Sheriff also had, you know, provisions. None was found for the city, but there were for the county. And so there's also fishing, there's some land pathways related to bait, aquarium, and different things. And so you'll see each one is slightly different. So Smith Mountain Lake in Virginia, it has more jurisdictions. It's actually managed by, there's 3 counties that border Smith Mountain Lake. And so this pathway analysis is a little more lengthy because there's actually several cities like the city of Roanoke and the various counties that are involved. And so we tried to think a little bit outside the box as well with respect to our recommendations. They weren't all like, you should just adopt another law, right? So for Smith Mountain Lake, because there is a Tri-County Lake Administration Commission, which is intended to try to coordinate conversations among those jurisdictions. Some of the recommendations were just for the local governments to consider engaging in conversations with that commission about how you might, you know, address some of these pathways. Others were looking at down here, like for aquaculture, you know, that's different in every state about whether local governments have, you know, any jurisdiction whatsoever around aquaculture. But, you know, one of the recommendations was just to evaluate, you know, what your risks are in Smith Mountain Lake from aquaculture and to consider adding provisions to the code if necessary. So I'll just walk through one more. So like Lake Shasta in California, same thing. It takes the same approach. You'll just see, you know, the boxes are a bit different for every case study because, you know, some case studies have more jurisdictions. There may be more state laws or less state laws on the books. And so we hope that these case studies just provide a snapshot of how local governments really can take action and are already seeking to prevent and manage invasive species risks in their jurisdictions. And so with that, I think I'll just go back to the last slide here, just so you can take a screenshot if you want. For more information for the National Secret Law Center, the Model Law Project, we have a project webpage for that. You can also access the AIS Toolkit at its website. And if you have any questions, you can contact me for more information, or Lisa as well, if you have her contact information from other projects. And with that, I think I'll be happy to take questions. I've seen some in the Q&A in the chat box.
And such really just useful resources, the catalog of regulations, and just so much packed into that website. It's phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. Okay, we do have one question in the Q&A. Can you see that? Can you see that, Stephanie? I'm going to read it because our participants can't see it until it's answered. Or actually, I'm not sure if that's true anymore. But anyway, let me just read it for you. From Christy, there's also a gap in filling in helping states prepare for the changes in regulating incidental discharges, such as the effluent, including metals, chemicals, biological materials, and species from in-water cleaning of vessel biofouling. Is this something that the National Sea Grant Law Center might be interested in working on?
Yes, so yeah, we are happy to talk to and So Christine, we'd be happy to talk about what the needs are. I'm assuming that's probably coming from some of the changes related to VEDA. We followed some of it, but we haven't done kind of a formal project related to that. Depending on how big it is, we might need to find some funding to help with that. But yes, the National Security Law Center would be happy to engage in kind of planning conversations.
Okay, if you have questions for Stephanie, put them in the Q&A box. We do have time for more questions. I have some questions while we wait for the audience to put some in. What's next? You said you're almost 10 years working on this particular issue. Is there another project coming, or is there another step that you would like to take with the research?
Yeah, so with respect to this one, we are currently trying this summer to update our state compilation. We haven't done that since December of 2018. We know, there's been a flurry of activity. We'd also like to those that are familiar with the project might know we also did a comparative analysis of how states are kind of implementing the model rules, and I'd like to update that too. So that's kind of one of our summer tasks. Lisa and I have been thinking about how we can expand the toolkit to really dig into this federal, tribal, state to local continuum, and to maybe do some case studies that are more regional based, say around like the lower Colorado River, or some other geographic area that would really let us kind of dig into. So how do you move something from a national federal policy through state implementation to kind of local as well? And so, yeah, we have been kind of kicking around a proposal idea for that. We haven't found funding for it yet, but we've been, kind of looking for places for that. So yeah, I think that would be a next step for the toolkit specifically as well.
Okay, that would be great. And I did put the links to both of the projects in the chat for everyone. So you have those links that you can click on them and bookmark those and save those. I really recommend going through the website, because there's a lot of different, like Stephanie just mentioned, the gap analysis. That is so critical, because it compares and tells which states have which parts of the model legal framework. So if you're wondering, what does my state have? That's a tremendously useful resource. Or how does X state compare? And so that's great that you're thinking about updating that. And then certainly there was done by NISC in the task force, there was the federal legal review, I think. I forget what the official term was, but I love your concept of, okay, tribes and the federal, how does it all work together? Now that you've done the hard work of defining those different roles. So that would be really interesting. Okay, more Q&A popping up. Okay, so there's a question here about how are aquatic invasive plants being handled? And I can just make a plug really quick that we have an aquatic plant priorities webinar happening on Thursday, sponsored by the Aquatic Plant Management Society. So if you're interested in plants, please check that out on Thursday. But Stephanie, do you want to talk about the plants and plug memo and rule and the clean drain dry work that you did in conjunction with WAFWA and their resolution?
Yeah, so we actually, and that's also available on the Model Legal Framework webpage. We have looked specifically, now I don't know specifically in Canada, but looking at what states are requiring drain plugs to be open during transport, as well as whether there are express provisions to remove visible aquatic plants from watercraft or trailers or different things. And so, yeah, it does seem like more states in the last, 5 years or so have enacted rules and regulations to kind of make sure that the drain plugs are open so that the water drains out and that there isn't any visible plants.
And certainly, this is also interesting because it's really focused on that pathway. And I love what you did in the resource toolkit, looking at kind of expanding the watercraft pathway and looking at different types of ways that ANS can move, or AIS can move. And Stephanie and I have talked about weed-free products as like another prevention pathway program. Stephanie, let me ask you, we have Don't Move Firewood, and we have several different pathway prevention programs nationally. Can this approach apply to the non-aquatic pathways? And yeah, let me just leave it there. And because I know even with firewood right now, with emerald ash borer deregulation, that was our webinar, I think 2 webinars ago, the patchwork of state and local regulations in comparison to the federal, it's hard to understand and it's hard to be effective. So do you see this being a model that we could use and to add some maybe terrestrial or non-aquatic pathways?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is a really important approach that, although it does take work to, because you're right, it's so complicated, but it's essential to really understanding how you can manage a particular pathway. So I do think that you could do this type of analysis for any pathway, whether it's, you know, weeds or firewood. One thing that really struck me as we were working on the local AIS toolkit and those case study pathway analysis is it's kind of interesting to think about on the local level who has authority to do it. And they, you know, the county individual agencies may not see a role for certain things, but we found, you know, you have a parks commission that's responsible for what's happening on park land. And so a county could easily, you know, say you have to only have certified firewood or approved firewood in a county park. A city could do that if they allow camping, you know, in those type of situations. But it might also be your local transportation department if they're responsible for right-of-ways or movement of goods kind of in and out. So I think that was the value of the pathway analysis, is just taking kind of a fresh look about, well, could this authority be broadened just enough to capture what you're trying to get after, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. And I know from my experience, it's the importance can't be understated of doing this kind of cross-jurisdictional legal research and knowledge sharing, because at least in my space here in the West, these lakes and reservoirs have many different management entities around the same water body. So you have a federal dam, and you have maybe National Park Service land, maybe BLM land, maybe tribal land, maybe county land, and a state park, all mixed in on the same reservoir. And if the rules are different, then nobody knows what's going on. And so it's really, really important. And then of course, those boats, we've seen they're traveling all across the continent. And so, you know, understanding what the rules were on the where they came from and where they're going. Otherwise, how do people know how to comply? Right. And that's kind of the beauty of Play Clean Go, is that it's very simple messaging for the recreationist, right? It's very simple messaging. But on the management side, boy, it's like I love just even what did you call it? The clearinghouse. It's like, okay, this is where you need to go if you want to know what the other rules are, especially if you're trying to improve yours or create new ones.
Yeah, I think the other benefit of the conversation too is that there are usually, most jurisdictions, you know, have some sort of default rule somewhere that says they can incorporate, you know, maybe a local government has an enforcement agreement, maybe a city allows the county to enforce their laws or vice versa. The Corps of Engineers can incorporate local law. But, you know, if you don't know that local law is there, maybe the mechanism just hasn't been negotiated to allow it to apply elsewhere. So that's another thing that we kind of caution against. You don't always have to adopt something new. You may just have to make sure that it's broad, you know, it's broad, and the enforcement is an option for. Oh,
that's interesting. Yeah. Okay, we do have one more question that popped up in the Q&A from Meg. What is the status of the Federal Invasive Species Caucus? The caucus is co-chaired by Representative Stefanik and Representative Thompson, and it is active in this Congress, and NISAW's legislative committee has been working with them. So if you're a member, we invite you to join the legislative committee and get involved. But feel free to drop me an email, and I'm happy to chat with you or connect you in any way with them. But yes, great question. Thanks for asking. Okay, so any more questions for Stephanie? Go ahead and put them in. I'm happy to keep chatting with her. So the networked approach. Okay, let's talk about this for just a quick second, because like you've hit the nail on the head. It's something everybody knows is needed, and people try, really, really, really hard to do that. But in some places, it's a little bit more difficult than others. And when the laws and the regs and the direction from leadership don't jive, then it can be really hard to be effective with that networked approach. And in this role here at NISAW, you know, one of NISAW's main charges is to try to connect the dots, to be the umbrella, to provide the network connections, and to be able to help in whatever way we can, because we're not government, right? We're nonprofit, we're an NGO. So Stephanie, what advice would you give me or other NGOs and nonprofits maybe that want to try to help, try to empower that networked approach, but we're not the regulators? What can we do to help?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. What I felt like, it seems like what's missing is, as you mentioned, kind of either guidance or like direction. So I feel like one thing we need is that for the layers of government kind of at the top to be clear about how they see the lower levels of government fitting in, right? So I think it would be really helpful for Fish and Wildlife Service or Forest Service to really think about, okay, we have this invasive species policy. How can a state government help? Where do we really need the help from the state government or a tribal government? And then I think the state government can do the same thing on the local level to say, okay, we have this state law about weeds or firewood. How can the local government best help us achieve our goals? And so I would think that kind of nonprofit organization, other organizations in the arena can help by maybe kind of helping to facilitate those conversations or pushing a little more to say, okay, you have this policy, you have this objective, where do you see everybody in this network fitting in? And really trying to get some clear statements about this is where we want the states to play a role, this is where we want the local. And I think with that, then it would become clearer about how much money it would take to do that or what capacity you need. It would be more concrete rather than just vague kind of policy statements.
Okay, and I have a follow-up for you. How does that change across the country? Like, I know it's not the same everywhere, right? And so you purposefully picked your case studies to have that representative view. Did you find that in some places the state is pushing the agenda more, or the federal government's pushing the agenda more, or really in your cases it was the choice to take action really empowered at that local level to protect their local resources, or was it just varied?
Yeah, it does vary. For our case studies, we didn't focus as much on federal state who was kind of leading the conversation. What really jumped out at us was the difference in states that are really where the counties are empowered and the counties kind of have more authority. So like in Minnesota, a lot of authority rests at the county level, and they had a lot of activity, but they were also, the state has funded counties to run local programs. But then if you go to some place like Virginia, the local governments don't have as broad authority. They can only do what they've been told they can do. And it seems like it's more based in the cities rather than like the counties. And so I think that is a really important distinction. I think one thing Lisa and I have talked about, the need when you're doing these type of pathway analysis, is to really think and understand which player has the authority to accomplish what you want. And that may change. Like in some places, the state may be the leader, and that's where you'd want to focus your energy. But in other places, you might have a lot of authority at a county level, and you could accomplish more by working through the counties versus like maybe you don't want to go to a federal agency that has limited flexibility. So it would depend by water body, by state, by jurisdiction, but it's important to know that when you're developing projects.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Yeah, and I see that with the other taxes too. I see that with weeds and as well, that it does vary, but just figuring out that authority first really helps the conversation move forward to action. Okay, one more question for you. Are you open to more case studies? And if folks have updates to local plans, if there are new local AIS plans, new local regulations, do they send that information directly to you?
Yes, so we are open to suggestions for additional case studies. The Cayuga Lake case study we actually added after the project launched because we got some feedback on that one. Whether we can do it depends on kind of the capacity of Lisa and the National Sea Grant Law Center right now, but we would love to hear suggestions for good case studies. We're also happy to work with local governments that might want to go through this process together as well. And absolutely, if you have an example of a plan, an ordinance that you think should be added to the website, that's easy. Just send me an email and we can get it added.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. If there are no more questions for Stephanie, I am just going to share a few closing slides if I can find them again here, and just let you all know what we have coming up. Uh-oh, what did I do with my Zoom? Okay, there's Zoom. Whoop, I didn't lose you. There you go. Okay. So again, thank you to Stephanie, wherever you are in the world. If you're out on the boat ramp or sitting at home or in your office, please stand up, give her a round of applause. So appreciate her time today to share with us, as well as all of the work and guidance over the years. And certainly a shout out to Lisa as well. We appreciate her so much. We've had Molly Bodie behind the scenes today running tech. So as always, big thanks to Molly. Lots of good thanks in the chat. Okay, again, National Invasive Species Week Part 2 is underway. If you don't already know, we have a brand new event map up on NISAW.org. Take a look. If you're holding a webinar, if you're holding a local event, go ahead and put it in there so we can promote you and what you're doing. And if you're looking for something to do locally, go on and see what's available in your area. Of course, we have our free webinars. Invite your friends, spread the word. Our resource toolkit is up on the website. And keep up with us on Facebook and Twitter and social, hashtag NISAW and hashtag Invasive Species Week. If you're out in the field this week, take some pictures of your crew, take some selfies, show us what you're working on. We would love to see what you're doing out there and promote, again, you and the good work that you are doing. So just to let you know what we have coming up the next couple days. Wednesday, we have an outstanding lineup of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and U.S. Department of Agriculture experts from our Biological Control Committee to talk through the regulatory process for classical weed biocontrol. Stephanie, you might be interested in it, but we're going to go all the way from the moment that the idea, to create, the problem is issued for an invasive species, particularly weeds that need biocontrol, to the point where you can actually get those agents and use them. So can't wait for that. Really excited for that. Thursday, again, our aquatic plant management priorities, sponsored by the Aquatic Plant Management Society. And then Friday, a comparison of state noxious weed lists. So we'll look at the invasive plant side of regulation, and then we'll get a presentation on the Western Weed Action Plan. So I hope that you can be with us the rest of the week. If you miss it, if you're busy, if you're out in the field, if you can't sit still, if it just doesn't work for you, don't worry about it. You can watch the recordings on NASMA's public YouTube channel. Okay, we'll get those up in about a week or so. So give us a few days to get those processed and we'll get them put up there. So that concludes our event today. Assuming that we have no more questions, we look good to go. Again, Stephanie, thank you, thank you, thank you. So appreciate you, and I look forward to working with you some more. Thanks to all of our attendees today. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and we will see you soon. Thanks. Bye-bye, everyone.